Today, it seems there's an electric vehicle being designed and brought to market for almost every type of consumer. In our most recent video, titled Why Everyone is Making EVs Now, we listed off nearly 24 new and upcoming electric vehicles. And each one of these has its own unique set of quirks and features and a loyal fan base of reservation holders, customers, and enthusiasts that can't wait to get behind the wheel. The market is full of promise right now, and because of this, it's an exciting time to be an EV enthusiast. But it wasn't always this way. With our first episode of Kilowatt Hour, we're taking a look back to see how far EVs have come and how far they still have to go. To help us with this, I'll be chatting with Chelsea Sexton. Chelsea has been an advocate for EVs ever since her early work on the EV1 program. She's a legend in the industry, and I'm excited to have her as our first guest today. Hi, Chelsea. To get us started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into EVs in the first place?
I am Chelsea Sexton. I usually describe myself as just a girl that plays with cars, but starting 25 years ago, those became primarily electric cars, and these days includes everything from scooters to buses to Class 8 trucks. So I'm all about replacing fossil fuels with electrons in anything we possibly can.
Wonderful. And so tell me a little bit more about how you got into EVs specifically, because I believe you used to work in a dealership if I researched properly.
I can't imagine what you find on Google. Yeah, I started selling gas cars. I started selling Saturns at the age of 17, just as a means to an end, putting myself through college. And I figured I would go off and be a sign language interpreter, which is what I was studying. And car sales was good money for that age and lots of downtime for homework. And it seemed like a win. And a few years into doing that, my finance manager came to me and he goes, yeah, that electric car that we've been talking about that GM's doing, they're hiring for it. And you are such a nerd. This would be totally up your alley. Here's a phone number. You should call this number. They're hiring. And so on a whim, I did. I'm very shy. It wasn't my nature, but I figured what the heck. And a few weeks later, I am working for that program. So I moved over to GM from the dealer side and started on the EV1 program and went back to Tennessee for training, drove it for the first time on the back roads of Tennessee, discovered I like torque and horsepower more than anyone rightfully should, and basically fell in love and never looked back.
You were on the inside of this monumental program that then got shut down. What did that look like?
Right. Yeah, the EV1 was, it's sort of considered the first modern electric car because there were EVs before that, dating back before the 1900s. But it was the first one of that era, and most of the other automakers followed, or at least the Americans and Japanese. So it started with GM presenting this concept car called the Impact at the time, became the EV1, deciding to produce it, and the California government, CARB, said, oh my God, we've been looking for a solution to our air quality problems. I mean, we grew up in smog. So if you guys are saying you can actually do this non-polluting car, then the whole industry can start doing that. And so GM unwittingly inspired the original ZEV mandate. So they went from wanting to do it to very quickly being told to do it, and nobody wants to be told what to do. So the moment it became a mandate, all of the automakers started fighting it. So the EV1 was very iconic. It was one of the few that was actually leased to consumers versus most of the EVs of that era were just for fleets. And it was iconic in design and in performance. It was purpose-built. It was really aerodynamic. It was very distinctive. People either loved or hated it, but mostly loved it. It was kind of weird looking compared to a conventional car. And all of the other ones tended to be, ironically, SUVs, trucks, and station wagons. So it also was unique in being one of the smaller cars of its generation, which is the opposite of the scenario we have now. So we started putting them on the roads. The customers loved them. They obviously eventually got arrested for them, but the automakers were fighting this regulation the whole time. And so on one hand, they're leasing them out and in a few cases selling them from the other automakers, while also trying to convince the Air Resources Board that there's no market for these things. We're doing them because we have to, but really you're forcing us to do something that not only losing money on, no one wants them anyway. And eventually they were successful. And so at the end of the lease, which always was going to be a lease only, they took the cars back and crushed them. So there was never a secret about what would happen to those exact cars, although even at the time, the GM party line was very much, we are leasing them right now, in part because battery technology will get better and lots of things are evolving. And so once all that sort of stabilizes, then we will sell them. So we did sort of offer customers the promise of maybe one day you'll be able to buy them, but we were not disingenuous with what would happen to those leases. So it wasn't a bait and switch in that way, but nevertheless, because the drivers loved them so much, they were incredibly disappointed when that time came and they were unable to convince GM that no, really, people do like these cars. And same thing for those of us on the inside. It wasn't shocking. And it took 6 years or so for it all to play out. And we tried for many of those years to sort of convince our leadership that no, people do really like them. We were sure for a long time that it was just, they're sitting back in snowy Michigan. They don't really get it, what it's like out here in California and how much people do like them, even with somewhat limited range on the Gen 1 cars. The Gen 2 cars had twice the range of the early Leafs. So they were significantly better, but also rather compelling in the scheme of early electric cars of this generation. And eventually we were unsuccessful. So we thought the media would come tell the story. They didn't do that either. We held a funeral for the car because we thought, oh, that's a little bit of a stunt. That'll get some coverage. And it did. But it was basically covered as EV drivers bid fond farewell to their cars and get ready for hydrogen. And we were just like, yeah, that's not the story. And so one of our drivers decided he was going to make a movie, got together with another one of the drivers who paid for it and spent 5 years filming it. And that became Who Killed the Electric Car, which is how many people who have come to know of that generation of EVs have learned about it.
Of course, that's how I found out about you, actually, was from that movie and just
That's
watching.
How anyone found out about me.
Sure.
No one knew I was alive before that because I was always so shy and anonymous.
Sure. And so can you tell me just a little bit about how did that transition work? Because obviously you're working inside the company, but also trying to convince the company that's tearing these cars down that this is actually something they should continue making.
Yeah, I mean, that was exactly what it was for the longest time. And that was also well before all this public stuff. So from the inside, we were just we started building a waiting list. We tried to do whatever we could think of to convince the internal leadership of General Motors that, no, this really is a thing that people want. And yes, that early range of the first one was not enough, but the second one's really compelling and more people wanted. And it took us a while to catch on because we weren't yet old enough or bred to be cynical. It took us a while to catch on that creating demand was precisely the problem because the way the mandate was written is that automakers had to build and market electric cars in accordance with demand. So as long as there was demand, they were going to be compelled to build. And so we didn't realize at first that, there was a point at which GM decided, yeah, that demand is not such a great thing. And part of it happened, it was not that way from the start. Part of it happened as leadership changed. There's a common dynamic in the industry that is sort of the car guys versus the bean counters. The engineers loved that car like we did. Some of the finance guys, not so much. And so there's always that kind of tug of war inside all of these companies. And so from one year to another, as those leadership dynamics would change, their attitude toward the program would change too. But as time went on, it was very clearly in one direction. And that was not in the favor of the people who loved EVs.
Okay. So, coming at this from the outside, it seemed almost like the EV1 program was doomed to fail from the beginning. But from what you're saying now, it's like, no, it was something that they weren't sure of. It was really an experimental, almost a beta program. And once they looked at the program from a high level, once leadership came in and said, actually, if this is successful, if EV1 is successful, we can't have a successful longer term business. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, but there was a phase before that. As a program, it was originally planned to be a real program with shockingly impressive volumes, especially for its time. Even today, the original production intent for the EV1 and the numbers they had originally planned to build would rival, we'll say, the MachE introduction and its current sales pacing. It was very legit. Things changed along the way, obviously. And some of this was sort of pre-mandate days, and then that changed attitudes. And some of it was reality of, these were hand-built cars, 8 or 9 stations with no conveyors in the Lansing Craft Center, with all of the quality issues that might imply. And for anyone who's paid close attention to early Teslas, it was not incredibly dissimilar. And they were incredibly low volume in the end. They only ever built just over 1,100 of them. So 4 or 5 cars a day was kind of the output when push came to shove. And therefore, all of the things that come with hand-built cars came with that one, especially the first generation. So it went from like, yes, this is really going to be a real program to this is the first compliance car. And we talk about compliance cars today all the time. But what it eventually became was a box ticking exercise of we'll build as many as we have to meet CARB SEV mandate and not a single one more than that. And we, by the end, had to sort of ration them out to hit exactly that one number and not any more than we absolutely had to sell or lease. We always called them sales.
That's got to be such an interesting, almost existential crisis, just seeing that happen, being enthusiastic about your career growth, and then see the whole program kind of take almost, I don't want to say a nosedive. The program took just an unexpected turn, but for GM, potentially a necessary turn. And so at what point did you decide, that maybe you're going to fight against GM, or even that you actually, I believe, obviously left GM? So at what point did that decision get made for you?
Oh, I hung on till the very end until I was invited to leave. At the end of the program, the choices were to try to jump to another car program or leave the company. And I don't know, the next Buick wasn't all that compelling to me after EV1. So I didn't have my own career in mind so much. I started EV1 at 20 years old. That wasn't even on my radar screen at the time. I just really liked that work. To this day, in hindsight, it was a dream job. I was so lucky to find something I liked that much, that early, and then therefore was led to sort of cobble together this really unusual career ever since, because I knew I'd found my thing. So the choice to leave was in some ways made for me because of lack of options. The fighting part it's still not my thing. But we never had a grand plan. It was more of a day by day, what's the next step to try to tell this story? And we did sort of have this notion of, even if you think we're the crazy ones for liking these dorky little EVs, where's Frontline? Where's PBS? Where's somebody that's kind of interested in these dorky people in their EVs? And it was that inclination that spurred on the funeral and some of the other stuff, because we thought, even if we can't change it by this point, we would just want to get the story out there. We want it sort of documented that this happened. We didn't want it to just sort of go by and be forgotten, except for 4 people who know of the Edsel, to be that kind of a story.
Absolutely. And it really is a compelling story. I guess my question becomes, what do you think could have changed the outcome of either the EV1 program, or how would, if the outcome of the EV1 program, if that had changed, how would that have changed our future as we see it today? I think at this point, Tesla is largely credited for making EVs popularized. Do you think is there any world in which that would have changed, or?
Yeah, I see it in 2 ways. On one hand, it's not surprising that the automakers fought the mandate. Nobody wants to be told what to do. Automakers, all industries fight their regulators. It's just sort of how that dynamic works. So on one hand, had CARB not sort of caved at the time, and they really did, they sort of bought the line when the automakers went, God, no, we're trying so hard, we can't get anyone to want these. And CARB went, okay, we get it. And the automakers said, if you give us a pass on EVs, the Japanese automakers promised them hybrids, and the American automakers promised them hydrogen, and CARB kind of said yes to everybody. So I understand where they were coming from, but the basic reality is that tweak in the early 2000s largely was the nail in the coffin. And EVs to this day are still very externally driven by regulation. So that basic dynamic remains the same, but it was especially important then. At the same time, as self-inflicted as it was, had GM sort of come out and said, look, we're ending the EV1 program. It's a business decision. We'll pay whatever penalties we have to pay, and we're going to move on, we wouldn't be sitting here. And there's a fair amount of argument that says, for GM's sake, they lost a decade. They were ahead for quite a long time, and they eventually came to see that. And Rick Wagoner once was asked after he retired from GM what was his biggest mistake, and he said killing the EV1 program. Not because he thought it had such an amazing market at the time, but he saw in hindsight that they did have that kind of lead, and they kind of gave it away.
Yeah.
And they had Tesla level passionate owners, and GM would kill for that now. A lot of the early Tesla Roadster people were EV1 people first. And so we sort of bred a lot of that kind of enthusiasm, which is as much to do with the technology as the brand, but they were really protective of the brand too. They were the kind of owners that any brand would love to have. And so that's unfortunate for GM. At the same time, because they did it that way, because they came out and said, we tried so hard, we couldn't get anyone to want them, it basically created our story for us, especially when we had a GM employee emailing us pictures of crushed cars anonymously. We knew it was happening, but we didn't have visuals until one of their own people sent them to us and opened up an anonymous email address and said, here you go, use them for whatever you want, just don't ever try to find me, I need to keep my job. And so we did. And so all of the close-up pictures from ground level that you see of those stacked up EV1s came from that person. And the overhead helicopter ones were the ones that Chris Payne, our director, went out and got with another EV1 driver. So the story itself was emboldened by the fact that they took them all back and crushed them all. And that all led to lots of things, including Elon Musk saying, yeah, I watched all that passion the people had for EV1, and that helped inspire me to do Tesla.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I'm one of those people that cannot allocate credit to just one person or one thing. This has been such a community effort from the very beginning. And the community of drivers, the community of enthusiasts who wanted to become drivers, and the community of happy warrior individuals inside these companies and organizations and agencies sort of championing the cause against all odds, but also that everybody stands on the shoulders of others. So as much as I'm excited about what's happening today, I can't help but be proud for all of those engineers who created a car that was so cool and so iconic that people were willing to get arrested for it and make movies about it and help start this movement that has transpired since and is still going.
Absolutely. And so I guess I want to get to that, but I want to hear about what has your career looked like, even just at a high level, between leaving GM and now? What is it that you do? Tell me a little bit more about yourself as we get into what the EV industry is now and your thoughts on it now. I want to hear about, what have you been doing over the last several years?
I have worn lots of hats, and I tend to stir all the pots. I mean, I've done a bunch of things. I co-founded Plug in America, and that was sort of the outcropping of all the protesting and all the agitating and trying to save electric cars, but then shifting to encouraging automakers to build them again and policymakers to have stronger standards. That organization was formed, like 15 years ago now, 17 years ago. And it still exists today? Yeah, it's the largest consumer-facing advocacy group for electric transportation in the United States. So they've been going strong forever. I led the organization for several years, but I stepped aside quite a while ago and root them on from afar and occasionally conspire with them, but they've been off and running ever since. And I have spent some time in venture capital, and we were the first investors into Tesla. So that was really fun. And I ran an automotive enterprise for a while. And I've also done a lot of independent consulting and advising and things for the last 15 years or so. And I occasionally write here and there. And I have been a presenter on the Fully Charged show for a couple of years. And mostly I just sort of play with everybody.
It seems like a lot of doing whatever you can to nudge the industry forward. Like if there's a way, whether it's politically or socially, whatever it is, moving the industry forward. That's
very much it. Yes.
Okay. Very cool. And so then, I guess, as we look at the market today, obviously, at least from where I'm standing, it seems, at least in California, it seems like EVs are becoming more and more the obvious decision for people. I know there's going to be people that disagree with that opinion, depending on where you're at, but I think it's going to become more and more clear in the next coming years. But I'm curious, as you look at just the industry, what are your thoughts as far as the transition? How far along are we? How much further do we have to go? How much more advocacy do we need versus just great products? What does the industry look like to you?
We need lots. Yeah, I mean, on one hand, because things are happening now, it feels like it's happening really fast and it's all off and running. And yet one of the things I battle the most when talking to people is complacency. It is exactly that sense of it's a rolling snowball. It'll all take care of itself. We can all go off on holiday now. And the reality is we've achieved almost 2% penetration of EV sales nationwide. And we all talk about, we're past the early adopters. The early adopter phase alone goes to about 14%. California is about 10%-ish, give or take these days. So we're further along, but we're still in early adopter phase in California. And over half of Californians are not aware of electric cars. Even after 25 years of being the US's Norway on this front, of sort of being the leader, awareness is still really, really low. And outside of California, it's far worse. And lack of product remains our single biggest challenge. We've had a bunch of sort of compliance cars. We've had a bunch of small cars. We've had, a bunch of really expensive cars. We've not had a lot in the middle. Trucks are coming, yay, but they're not here yet. We don't yet have the variety that people are used to in the internal combustion space. And no single car is the car for everyone. I know there's a tribe of people who believe it's fine, Elon Musk will take care of everything, but not everybody wants a Tesla, just like not everybody wants a GM or a Ford or whatever. So we need that variety in order for everyone to be able to find the thing that works for them. But we also need geographic distribution. We need cars available nationwide, not just California and the CARB states, which is basically the West Coast and the Northeast. And occasionally the South gets, Atlanta gets a few cars here and there, but that's about it. We don't have that much availability, and the middle of the country really does not. So people need more options. They need to be more aware of them. The marketing and education and general awareness about this is really fairly low. If more than half of Californians don't know about them, the rest of the country is worse, and people cannot buy what they don't know about, even if you've made this great, compelling car. And we also have to solve dealers as number 3. So you can develop amazing cars, you can spend millions marketing them, and if someone walks into a dealer and a Ford guy says, you'd really rather have the gasoline F-150 or the diesel, we've wasted billions of dollars between product development and marketing. So we have to get them on board as well, which is not as hard as everyone makes it out to be, but it needs the intention to do it. We need really good training. We need occasionally to tweak pay plans and things, but mostly it comes down to really human factors. People are never going to be good at selling something they're not comfortable with, whether it's radios or TVs or cars. They're not comfortable with the technology. They're not going to be able to explain it to you, and they're not going to try to encourage you to adopt it if they don't have the experience themselves. So these are all things we have to tackle even before getting to conversations like charging infrastructure, et cetera.
Interesting. Yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. And I've got some fairly strong opinions about how that can happen, but I'm very curious to steer yours. My opinion on specifically that last one, for the dealership model is that there's not often incentives for that. And there's not incentives either at the dealership or sometimes larger at the corporate level. And do you see that changing? Do you say any companies that are maybe doing it right, any companies that are doing it wrong in terms of adjusting their models? Volkswagen's coming out with a whole bunch of EVs. GM is improving their existing EVs. Are they doing it right in their rollout, or is there ways that maybe some of these companies could be accelerating or changing their plan to make sure that we are actually walking in the right direction?
There is no company that is doing it all right or all wrong. We could pick apart any of them. I think all of them can stand to improve on the dealer front, and primarily through really robust training. I mean, that's the place where I would start. It's certainly the most economical thing to go for. There is a perception that it takes so much longer to sell an EV, and actually the data doesn't necessarily back that up, but as long as those perceptions remain, that will transpire. And one way to solve that is to get people more comfortable with the conversation. They should be driving EVs, at least somewhat. Generally speaking, most of the salespeople have never had a longer test drive in an EV than the one they're offering you. They've never taken it home. They have no idea what it's like to plug in at home at night and walk in and have dinner and go to sleep and have a full car the next day. So translating these things to their customers doesn't come as easily if they've never had the experience themselves. So if you think about it, sort of what are the stumbling blocks? It's not rocket science, and yet it does require the sort of cross finger pointing to stop, where the OEMs sort of say, well, we can't help that. They're all independent dealers. And the dealers are all saying, well, we get the support we get or not. And neither side is absolutely truthful. But also there's ample evidence that automakers know how to sell the cars they want to sell, whether it's through marketing or through dealerships, and they're incentivizing and all of those things. So the mechanics are all there. It's a matter of applying them to these models instead of incumbent gasoline models.
Fair enough. Because that's something that I've been more hesitant to say or to believe that the dealership model as it is can succeed in selling a large number of EVs, because I've only really seen companies that have stores rather than dealership models, Tesla, succeeding at large volumes because their entire incentive model is structured differently.
Well, except that let's look at that. Tesla has corporate stores. Frankly, Saturn had corporate stores. There's very little that Tesla has done that they're the first to do. What they have done well is combine various elements into a great package. If you think about Tesla's secret sauce when it comes to the consumer experience, they have really well-trained salespeople who are very passionate about their product in a low-pressure sales environment. There's not a lot to it beyond that. And there's literally zero about the fact that Elon signs the checks versus Penske that enables that. Any franchise dealer could create that if they wanted to. And some individual dealers have. I mean, obviously the entire Saturn brand was built on a lot of those same core values and that same experience. And that's part of why EV1 went to Saturn after originally being planned for Cadillac based on who the lessees were going to be. But Saturn was better known for great customer service and introducing new ideas to the public and all of those things. And so it landed with us. But there's nothing about the fact that corporate stores versus franchise stores couldn't provide a very similar experience. most of them have not chosen to outside of individual dealers and sometimes a dealer group. There's one in the San Fernando Valley that kind of adheres to these values and no haggle and a lot of that stuff. But automakers making the choice to try to encourage it for an entire brand would help move that needle. Otherwise, it's up to individual stores.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that I've experienced just as I'm trying to buy, I don't know if you know this, but I own a small fleet of Teslas that I rent out on Turo, as well as now a MachE. And I'm in the process of potentially buying a Volkswagen. And there's this perception with the Tesla community that, there are these massive markups. They'll take away the value of the tax credit in their dealer fees. So far, that wasn't the case with my Ford. And actually, based on what's been communicated to me about the Volkswagen, that's not the case either, that there will not be additional fees. So it does seem as if these companies are finding more and more appropriate ways to sell the cars through the dealership model.
Yeah. I mean, we have seen isolated cases of markup, and it was actually much more common in the early Volt and Leaf days than it is on the current models. And I think that's a combination of automakers discouraging it, and also all of us kind of calling it out, going, just because you can doesn't mean you should. I mean, that's the bottom line. So yes, all of those things will help as well.
Where does your passion for EVs versus hydrogen? Like, I often have to remind people that hydrogen is effectively a battery electric car. It's just a different type of battery. So where does your passion for EVs come from? Do you have hope for the hydrogens, the fuel cells of the world?
My feelings about hydrogen are not as strong as some people's. I mean, it has been a holy war, and I find the hydrogen's electric car too, co-opting to be kind of funny. It started years ago, and hydrogen is an electric car exactly as much as a gasoline Prius is an electric car.
Sure.
So, okay, fine. I mean, it's fair to say it's a zero emission vehicle. To equate it to a BEV is a little bit mushy with the semantics, but whatever. I personally do not expect hydrogen to catch on in the passenger vehicle market. I don't antagonize it. I don't come out against it. I just don't personally expect it to grow in large numbers, not because of anything to do with hydrogen, not because of all the fights about it being more or less efficient. From my standpoint, the biggest competition for hydrogen in passenger vehicles is not EVs. It is really decent plug-in hybrids. You take a Chevy Volt that is 90% electric already in terms of annual miles covered, and find me a regular consumer with an unfamiliar, expensive, hard to find, unreliable fuel versus buying 3 gallons of gas now and then. That is why I don't think hydrogen's going to catch on in the passenger market. They do tend to sort of come and they're a little patronizing in the message, like, yeah, you little EV people, you go have fun with your batteries, but you'll never be able to get enough and you'll come crawling back to us. I don't know. We'll see. On the medium and heavy duty side, that's more of an open question in my mind. And that's, I think, where the focus should rightfully be, is on those vehicles that are currently harder or more expensive to electrify with batteries, that could be served with a smaller distribution of fueling stations, especially in a fleet scenario. So some of those things actually, I think, might make more sense than passenger vehicles. But it's just a personal opinion on where I see the market going.
Absolutely.
And meanwhile, it'll happen or not happen. I mean, that's the funny thing, is how much time some people spend fighting about it one way or the other. And the only part that historically has frustrated me is the hypocrisy about the two fuels sometimes, where EVs are expected to prove their market before we give them any credits at all, but no one's ever asked that question about hydrogen. There's a lot of those types of, like, all electricity for EVs comes from dirty coal, but all electricity that goes into making hydrogen is all sunshine and fairies. There's a lot of those types of things that tend to be, inexcusable no matter what the issue is. And I resist how much they have been used, especially years ago, specifically to delay electric cars. So the political gaming of deployment for hydrogen is a problem. I don't have any issue per se with the technology itself. And from a nerd perspective, I've driven several of them and they're fun.
Great. And so I guess just as we look forward at the industry, like, is there any brands that you're particularly excited about, either, to see someone like GM come out with, I don't know, the new Bolt, or to see just more options broadly, because we talked about the access issue and having the whole industry kind of covered of, well, I want trucks, or I want small cars, I want big cars. Is there any areas that you're particularly watching that you're excited about developing?
I'm excited for trucks and things purely for the variety. I'm more of a small car girl myself, but I know that how many people want trucks, and I think it will be very cool to be able to point to those and offer them as options in my conversations. And there are really compelling ones coming. I also I'm excited so far, with a little bit of caveat, but I have been pleasantly surprised to see Ford's deployment of MachE so far. It's very respectable sales volumes, especially for a first year out. They're sort of pacing 25,000 units in their first year, give or take, based on the first third or so of the year, which is not only more than the Model S sold in its first couple years each. It's basically, aside from the Model 3, I think it's probably the second highest first year deployment of an EV.
Mm-hmm.
So that I think is very encouraging and deserves some credit. Obviously, it's not Tesla numbers, but if we sort of take Tesla out of the equation among everybody else, we sort of look at it and all the Tesla fans kind of go, oh, only, 2,000 units this month, but that's actually pretty decent. So I want to see more of that rather than crapping on it. It doesn't incentivize Ford to do any better if we kind of go, yeah, well, that's not impressive. So I'm happy about that, and I hope it continues. And so there's a lot to be determined in their overall commitment, but I think that's a good sign. I am hoping for something similar from Volkswagen, but it's too soon to say. But they have certainly promised lots of high volume cars, and I'm excited about more high volume cars than more low volume compliance cars.
I agree completely. And as it relates to the Mustang, it's a phenomenal car. I think a lot of Tesla fans will say, well, it's not as great in these that way or the other way, but I have it and it is comparable to my Model Y. As a first EV for them, that's incredible. It is quieter, it rides smoother, and some people really prefer the way that it looks. The Model Y kind of looks like a blown up Model 3, which kind of looks just kind of average to some people. And so I'm super excited to have it on the market. I'm glad that it's out there and that, they're selling well because they need to sell well to convince them to do more.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the thing that I look forward to and that tends to excite me is incumbent automakers actually demonstrating that they want to sell lots of EVs. The ironic thing is that even all the compliance cars fundamentally have been decent EVs. We all have subjective things. We like one over another. And obviously, a Fiat 500e is never going to be a Tesla. It's not trying to be. But there were no cars so far that you'd look at and go, God, I'm so sorry you bought that. So we've been in good shape that they've all been fundamentally decent cars. However, that doesn't mean that the automakers have wanted to sell lots of them. And none of these successes or failures based of the EVs of the last 25 years have been based on the car alone. The skin knees have always happened on the things around the car, not the car itself. In some cases, it's the sort of launch and leave thing, which GM has done in the past and is an open question going forward. It happened first on the Volt and then on the Bolt. We sort of created what is a really compelling car, put it in dealers, assume the rest would take care of itself and walk away. And that's kind of common, especially in the incumbent world. So backing up what is actually a pretty good car with customer support and marketing and after sales and all of the usual things that come with this are key to all of these rollouts, whoever it's from.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Do you think that there's a time in the future that it'll be clear when EVs are the best for all consumers? If it's not right now, if it's not because they're not all out on the road, is there a time in which it will become more obvious to the broader American population?
I'm sure it will be. And I know that right now people argue, well, they're already best for all consumers. And frankly, it doesn't matter what we think, it matters what they think. So when we start to see adoption in volumes that have their own momentum without external policy and regulatory control, that will be a very good indication. When automakers, besides the startups, are really selling every single one of them that they can, that's an indication. So, it's going to be little pieces. It'll be dot connecting for a while going forward. But when we start to see those things, when it doesn't matter so much what the CARB mandate is or Europe's CO2 policy, when they just become popular based on the business case, that will be an indication. But it's not going to, we can decide on somebody else's behalf. Oh, that's better for you. That's not the right way to do it.
It is interesting though, as someone that makes videos about EVs and really tries to focus on the numbers, on the utility of okay, this performance is better, it has more cargo space, it is objectively better for you. It is interesting when the response is, well, I still want this, or this is still easier for me. And even when I worked at Tesla, I had colleagues that they, had their car that they had on a lease and they were waiting for it to expire because like, yeah, this is what I've got right now is best for me. And hopefully someday I'll get a Model Y or a Model X. And I'd run them the numbers and see that, very quickly, that would actually work out mathematically to be a better decision to switch to an EV sooner. And it still took them a little bit of time. And so I'm curious, what is the best way to convince someone that an EV is for them?
Yeah. I mean, there's not a single right way, but we have to recognize that cars are an emotional purchase. It does not change just because they have plugs on them. And so as an overall movement, whether it's the auto industry or the well-meaning NGOs and Plug in America or all of us individually, we all tend to get in our own way a little bit by being overly pragmatic. And we tend to often talk from like, here's why you should want an electric car. Here's why they're good for the planet and you're going to save your children's asthma. And those messages are all appropriate in various points, but we should be starting from, here's why you will love an electric car. They're cool, they're fun, they're quick, they're smooth, they're quiet, they're safe, they're convenient. You'll never have to rush out of your house 10 minutes early in the morning because you didn't feel like getting gas the night before, on and on and on. So we need to talk more about those emotional experiences and not so much about the pragmatics. People buy emotionally and justify rationally. That means we have to start with the emotion. And as our executive producer from Who Killed puts it all the time, less spinach, more ice cream. But we have to sort of continue to keep that in mind and encourage everybody else because it's not necessarily intentional or malicious, but we end up in our own heads and we're a little defensive about the MSRP sometimes being higher, even though people tend to buy on payment. And if you haven't sold cars and kind of understand that dynamic, then it's even worse. And so we get really defensive and we start talking about all the other things and justifying. It's not how it works. It's a big tent and it's fun and it's welcoming and come on in. And we have to especially try to tamp down the siloing where we can. The infighting between the tribes has become a little bit untenable and certainly not productive. So the biggest step anyone will take is the thing with the plug. All the data shows they only go more electric from there. So we should not care what that first thing is, even if it's a minimally electrified plug-in hybrid, quite frankly, although I'm constantly pushing for better plug-in hybrids too. I will never shame a driver for picking their thing that works for them. I will absolutely challenge automakers to make them better cars. But that needs to be our collective balance. Welcoming to the community, challenging to the industry, and ourselves, all the rest of the professionals working in the space.
It absolutely is an emotional purchase. And I think that's why, we're going to have a lot of people buy the Mustang Mach-E over a Tesla Model Y. It's an emotional purchase. It has more of a spirit than a Model Y does. And so while some people, especially Tesla fans, are going to say, well, objectively, I want a car that does this and gets me to the point A to point B. And I can do comparisons where I show that the Mustang Mach-E doesn't compete quite in this way. We haven't launched a video on this yet, but we drove the Mustang Mach-E and the Tesla Model Y to Vegas and back. 1,000 miles round trip. It ended up where the Mustang was about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, if you include the Delta and charging remaining, behind the Model Y. But that is still phenomenal for basically a 24-hour trip to be right behind it. And so they're still a great car. And there it is. It's quieter. As some people say, it looks better. And I think we just need more options out there that have that emotional appeal.
Right. We do. I mean, we need more of all the things. I mean, I drove a Volkswagen ID4 for a few days and there were aspects of it I didn't love, but I have to say it's a very compelling package at a really reasonable price point that I think will be appealing to lots of folks. And so on one hand, there seems to be this sort of dichotomy within the Tesla tribes, which on one hand goes like, well, yeah, I mean, all these other cars are only because Elon. And his vision was always from the start to challenge the other automakers to make EVs, which fine, depends on when you came into the story, I guess. So yes, yay for more things. And he tweets about all of them. And yet he and they also turn around and trash all of the other cars. So it's like, how you can't have it both ways, but also what does that achieve? If your interest is in more electric miles and growing electric transportation deployment and replacing gasoline, I don't really understand what the value is in shaming another electric car adopter, especially a first one who's all excited. I mean, I have Leaf drivers, early Leaf drivers who think that their cars are quick like Teslas. And I don't disavow them of that. Like, why? What would that accomplish? Their experience is that they have this fun, fast, sporty car that they've never had before. Awesome. Go tear it up. Enjoy your car. Why would you sit there and go, yeah, but technically a Tesla's faster? And it is, but who cares?
Absolutely. I appreciate that, and I enjoy that energy. That's really the direction I think we need to take the conversation more, especially online, on Twitter. You always see these, the infighting almost, and it's just not helping with the overall objective. At least the stated objective of Tesla is getting more electric vehicles out there, and that's really what we should all be rooting for.
I appreciate all of that. We need all the energy we can get. And how quickly this happens is as much up to us as it is any of the automakers, or even Tesla for that matter. It is the overall community of folks that are trying to move this forward. Absolutely. And being as welcoming as we can.
I appreciate that energy, and I appreciate your time. Thank you for being with us, and hopefully I'll be talking to you soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for letting me crash your party.
All right, that's it for our first episode of Kilowatt Hour. I love what Chelsea had to say about making EV advocacy a welcoming and inclusive environment. We really need more of that energy in the world, and I appreciate that she took an hour out of her day to share her thoughts with us. I also want to thank you for listening. This is a bit of a pilot episode for us. We're going to try to host a couple of these each month, and as we're getting started, I would love to hear your thoughts, ideas, and feedback. If you have any questions or recommendations for us, shoot us an email at hi@kilowatt.media. Thanks for listening, and have a great rest of your day.